Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to take a look at a unique institution that affects everybody in the United States and everybody on planet Earth, and that's the United Nations. My guest today is an expert on the UN. Stephen Schlesinger is the author of a prize-winning history book on active creation, the founding of the United Nations. He is the former director of the World Policy Institute and currently is a fellow at the Century Foundation. Stephen Schlesinger, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much for having me.
I appreciate you being with me, Steve. Seems like we've done this 2 or 3 times in the past. Always very interesting. Before we go too far, I want to be sure and show your book, though, Active Creation, the Founding of the United Nations, which is really a definitive overview of how the United Nations was created, primarily by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States. The UN is celebrating its 75th anniversary this year. It came out of the deadliest world war ever, 60 million people killed. Europe lay in ruins, parts of Asia had been destroyed. How has the mandate of the United Nations changed from 1945 to where we are today?
Well, I'd say it has a much broader mandate than it had back in 1945. It was still an experiment in many ways back 75 years ago. The delegates who came to San Francisco knew that they were creating a kind of security body, but they didn't quite know what impact it would have on the world. I think the fact that the organization survived for 75 years tells you right away that obviously it filled a great need for security around the planet. And I think that one of the indices of that is the fact that you have all these new different UN agencies that have been spun off from the organization under its umbrella, simply because the demands of the world's population are great, and there is no other organization that can handle all of them. And that's why every problem that the world faces inevitably comes back to the UN.
Mm-hmm. And it certainly has. And of course, in 1945, they were dealing with the aftermath of World War II. They were dealing with poverty and that type of thing, but they weren't dealing with climate change. They weren't dealing with Ebola. They certainly weren't dealing with COVID-19 because that had happened in 1918, or COVID, shall we say. So it was a different world. Before I go too far, though, I want to mention to our viewers that for more information on this, you can go to www.stephenschlesinger.com to read more about his book and also many of the interesting articles that he's read. Well, let's take a look at some of the major UN agencies. And as I mentioned in the overview, they do impact our lives every day. We don't know about it the majority of the time, but we have to have the United Nations. Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, once said that the UN is not perfect, but it is indispensable. And it certainly is. It has its imperfections, but there is no other body to bring all 193 countries of the world together to focus on these problems and to work on them in a very collective, communal way, is there?
There certainly isn't. You take, obviously the one we're dealing with right now is the World Health Organization. There wasn't any body created to deal with pandemics or other health challenges until the UN helped set up that organization. And obviously it's played a sterling and an absolutely central role in dealing with the pandemic that we're facing right now. But you have the UN Development Corporation, which is an attempt to deal with helping societies build up middle-class kind of economic situations. You have the population fund, which deals with whole issues of family planning. I mean, you can just go through one after another. As I said earlier, each dealing with a particular problem which humanity faces, none of which was ever dealt with before the UN came along.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the World Health Organization. That's a major international organization. There are well over 150 countries that are member states of it, and they come together to focus on problems like Ebola, like COVID, just SARS, you name it. And it's absolutely critical. Now, the United States got out of WHO not too long ago, but apparently with the new administration, the U.S. goes back in. And how important is it for U.S. leadership and for the U.S. to benefit from the research, from the medical knowledge of the WHO and working with other countries?
It's absolutely crucial. I mean, one of the great lessons that Franklin Roosevelt learned from the Second World War was that the only way you defeat enemies of any sort is with other countries cooperating together, what they call collective security. And that applies to practically every problem we face today. Every whether it's environment, health, population, they all span national boundaries. They're international in scope. And so the fact is that the U.S. Is a lot by joining in these collective efforts. It doesn't have to expend all its own money on the problem. It can get contributions from the other 192 countries who are members of the UN in defeating that problem. And that's one of the great achievements that the UN has brought about, this idea that we all work together to help improve the livelihoods of people on the planet.
It's very, very important, absolutely critical, because you can't, for example, the COVID has to be defeated. This virus has to be defeated worldwide, or it will come back. It's just like polio or any other type of virus. You cannot say, well, one or two countries get rid of it and that takes care of the problem. It does not work that way.
That's absolutely right. And again, let's talk about the refugee situation. Refugees are a huge problem today, and it's not just in the Middle East. The Middle East, its problems have expanded into Europe. We've had problems from Central America expanding across our borders from Mexico, with all the people fleeing from poverty and violence in Central America. So refugees are a common problem around the world. They have to be dealt with in some way that allows the planet to make sure that these people are fed and clothed and taken care of. And the UN is the group that we always turn to for these solutions. They can't be done by one country alone.
Mm-hmm. And that's right. And the UN High Commission for Refugees, this year alone, I think about 15 years ago, they were working with 10 million refugees. This year, they're working with over 70 million people who have been displaced. And these people are not looking to move to the United States or to Canada or wherever. Most of them want to go back to their own homes. And so the High Commission for Refugees provides just basic services to keep them alive, to keep them healthy, to help educate them until they can return to their homes.
Yes, this is true. And again, we look at the issue of peacekeeping. I mean, that is a collective effort. When the UN was set up to make sure that conflicts did not spin out of control, local conflicts spin out of control and end up creating a third world war. And the UN has successfully solved at least 20 to 30 conflicts over the last 75 years that might well have led to a global catastrophe. But they did that collectively. They brought in peacekeeping troops or equivalent kind of missions that brought in soldiers from every country on the planet, in many cases, to stamp out these conflagrations and make sure that they did not expand. Again, the UN is there to bring together all these different countries around a common problem and agree on the solution and then drive that solution forward.
And anytime there's a UN peacekeeping mission, I can't remember the exact number right now. I think there are about 13 of them in very dangerous areas of the world, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, various places like that. Anytime they're there, this helps the United States in that US troops are not on the front line. The US is not shouldering the total bill. You have a collective sharing there where you have several hundred or a couple of hundred, well, 100 plus countries sharing the expenses of that. So really, peacekeeping is absolutely critical to not only the people in that area, but also to the folks in the United States. One problem I mentioned earlier, I think, if I didn't, I meant to, that is, in my opinion, the number one issue we're dealing with is climate change. And as we look back 10 years from now, we'll look back at this COVID-19. If all the dire predictions come true, and I hope they don't, I really do. But if they come true, we're going to say COVID was just an irritant. Climate change is what's really changing our planet. It's destroying our planet. How is the UN dealing with that? I know they've had many conferences, the UN Conference on Environment and Development, UNCED, in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. That really launched the UN, and they've been on the forefront of combating climate change. But what are they doing now, and what's going on with the Paris Climate Change Accord?
Yeah, well, the Paris Climate Accord basically was a UN venture. You know, it was one of the great accomplishments of the organization. Unfortunately, it suffered a big blow when Donald Trump, who's now the outgoing president of the United States, was the individual who decided to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord simply because he felt it threatened U.S. sovereignty, which I think was totally wrongheaded. But the U.S. is one of the biggest contributors to the problem of climate change, and so for us to just terminate our involvement is very tough situation if you really want to get to the point where you can control the problems and the ravages of climate change. So I'm hoping that a new administration led by President Biden will rejoin that accord. And if so, I think you're going to see a much different dynamic around the world for climate change. It will be one in which the UN will then have one of its biggest donors back on board, and therefore driving forward the issue in a very precise and comprehensive way, and hopefully convince other countries that this is the time to act.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of PBS or community access television station, or perhaps you're involved with an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you like our show, we would certainly encourage you to help share Global Connections TV with your friends, family, and colleagues. Today, we're taking a look at a unique institution, the United Nations, which impacts all of our lives. And we're talking with Mr. Steve Schlesinger. And Steve is the author of the prize-winning history, Act of Creation, the Founding of the United Nations. Steve, you're absolutely right about the climate change. This is a critical issue, and it's one that we really need to focus on very quickly. Time is running out. We can see that the latest reports indicate that we may have another 15 years to try to at least slow it down. If not, we're not going to reverse it, that's for sure. But one thing we can do is to move off of fossil fuels. And the countries of the world and the private sector, not just the governments, but the private sector is moving very quickly. They see it's much more efficient to get away from coal, slowly moving away from oil, a little bit away from gas, but it's best for their bottom line. It also improves our environment. Well, we're talking about issues, and we're talking about a variety of agreements at the UN and agencies. Another one that is so important that the United States got out of, unfortunately, was the Iranian nuclear deal. I'll just call it that. There's a longer title for it. We'll just say the Iranian nuclear deal. What was that? It was adopted in 2015. And where are we, and why should we be back in it?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, the 2015 agreement was designed to require that the Iranians give up on their efforts to create a nuclear bomb. Now, it did have a 10-year period at which point it was supposed to be revised. But at that time, the hope was that after that decade, there would be enough change within Iran, or the possibility there would be a new agreement that would supersede the one that Obama set up that would continue making it impossible for Iran to create a nuclear bomb. Of course, what happened was that when Donald Trump became president, he'd run his whole campaign on getting out of the nuclear deal with Iran, and he did so a couple of years into his term. And in doing so, he kind of left the agreement sort of half alive, because the other countries who were part of it, including several in Europe as well as Russia and China, still adhered to it. So it is possible that even while Trump pulled out, if now that Biden has won the election, he's the president-elect, when he comes into office, he may try to reestablish that agreement with Iran. Now that's going to have some difficulties, because obviously in 4 years, Iran has, changed in many ways its own willingness to adhere to the treaty. It was so furious, basically, for what the U.S. under Trump had done, that it in fact started enriching its nuclear program. And now, for Biden to go back into it, he has to get the Iranians to agree to go back to the original terms of the agreement, which they may not be willing to do. And also, he probably want to put some conditions on their involvement in terrorist activities around the Middle East. So it's going to be a very difficult situation for Biden to, approximate that old agreement from 2015. But I think he's willing to try. I do think the Iranians have a self-interest in working out a new deal with the U.S., because in that case, the U.S. would drop its sanctions against Iran, and those sanctions have been debilitating to the Iranian economy. So there are a lot of factors here, but yes, the agreement is still it's still possible that it could come back into operation.
And that's where all permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, the US, the UK, China, Russia, and France agreed, along with Germany, the European Union, and basically most of the world, to be quite honest, to get into it. And the Iranian nuclear deal did work. It actually shut down the Iranians' ability to develop nuclear weapons. And that was the only goal. Now, there are a lot of criticisms of Iran. There are a lot of things Iran does we're not happy with, but they were not part of that agreement. So it did work, and we need to try to get back into it. Well, Steve, before we run out of time, let me mention 1 or 2 more agencies, if we can, just to do the alphabet soup potpourri. UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, created in 1945 by the United Nations, a major UN agency. Our educators have benefited from this. People in the cultural areas have. The scientists of the United States have benefited immensely, yet we're out of it. We're sitting on the sidelines. The Chinese are really moving into all these slots that the US has moved out of. We moved to the sidelines. Somebody will fill that void. Is that what's happening here with UNESCO?
It's absolutely true. I mean, you mentioned the Chinese. The Chinese have taken the position that this is an organization which the U.S. is withdrawing from, the UN. So they're going to start putting in their people all over the UN Secretariat and its agencies. They even bring in hundreds of interns, Chinese interns, throughout the body and its affiliates. And the U.S. is seen now as a lesser influence in the organization because of its at least public disdain for what the UN is trying to do. And I think that under those circumstances, the issue of UNESCO it has its own peculiarity, namely that the U.S. actually withdrew from UNESCO in 2011 because the U.S. Congress was furious that UNESCO allowed the Palestinians to come in as members of UNESCO, and they passed a bill that said that U.S. could not finance UNESCO anymore until the Palestinians left. Well, of course, the Palestinians have not left, and the U.S. has not therefore refunded UNESCO. And so in order for the President-elect Biden to go back into the organization, he would have to convince Congress to repeal that provision about the Palestinians. But on other, the Human Rights Council, which is another issue that the U.S. withdrew from under Trump. Now, the U.S. could return to the UN Human Rights Council, And it would, in doing so, I think it would help influence the outcome of decisions by that council, which would be more favorable to the issue of human rights, which is why it was set up in the first place. By relinquishing our post on the Human Rights Council, we have allowed human rights offenders from Russia to China to other authoritarian regimes to basically control the outcome of decisions by that council. So I think it was a grave error that we made, and I think it's very important under President-elect Biden that he make an effort to return to the council. So there are other of these agencies that the UN has precipitously withdrawn from, which have hurt our own national security interests.
Exactly. We have actually weakened ourselves over the past couple of years, and the US prestige has plummeted like a rock. Leadership is not viewed as a very high quality amongst most countries in the world of the United States, and it's going to be an uphill climb. It can certainly be done. There's no doubt about it. One thing I will mention right before we adjourn here, UNESCO, we were talking about that. I mentioned about the educational, scientific, and cultural activities. There's another program, the Man in the Biosphere program that UNESCO launched several years ago that basically will work with entities around the world when they have a pristine natural resource they want to preserve for future generations, yet convert it into some type of economic activity. And I know from the state I'm from, Kentucky, Mammoth Cave, one of the largest cave systems in the world, has participated in the Man in the Biosphere program. And they went to UNESCO years ago and got the technical assistance from UNESCO. UNESCO doesn't control 1 square inch of Mammoth Cave National Park, but they worked with the farmers, they worked with the people at Western Kentucky University, the business communities, to preserve Mammoth Cave, because the underground river was becoming a sewer is what it was. And they turned it around. It's now a very viable, pristine natural resource. And UNESCO just phases out. They help do that. They did it with the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, but there are all kinds of examples. And that's just more of a hands-on example of how a UN agency does help you, and it doesn't deprive us of our sovereignty. We hear that myth. How are we losing our sovereignty when we work with other people and we still retain our agenda, doing what we want to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact is that one of the great protections the US has is the veto power. We can veto anything that goes on at the UN. That's one of the privileges of being one of the founding sponsoring states of the UN. So that alone, but then of course, the UNESCO has anointed a lot of monuments around the world as kind of prestige items for countries to have, and to have a UNESCO designation to one of your outstanding monuments is very important to countries. It's a signal that the world respects and honors what you have accomplished as a country, and both in history and what you're doing to preserve it today. So UNESCO is a very powerful, good influence, as you illustrated in Kentucky, with preserving the great reminders of history in mankind.
Yes. And I might just mention too that they've declared Paducah, which is sort of the beautiful quilt capital of the world, as a UNESCO cultural site. Again, giving publicity to that area, again, helping to drive revenue into the Paducah area. So those are just hands-on examples. But if our viewers would like more information on what we've talked about, they can go to www.un.org, which is the United Nations site. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the UN is not a perfect organization, but it is indispensable. And Steve, I often think of Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the UN, who said, "The United Nations was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell." If there was ever a mantra for an organization that deals with some of the thorniest, some of the nastiest, toughest, most intractable problems in the world, it is the United Nations. But Steve Schlesinger, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.